When we do forecasting, we're trying to predict the future. And the best gauge of what will happen in the future is what has happened in the past. And the best way to keep track of what has happened in the past is to keep what's called a time series. And so a time series is nothing more than a measurement taken over time. So for example, if you're interested in looking at your weight, let's say this will be your y variable, and you want to see what goes on over time. So you might have, week 1, you take a measurement. Week 2, you take a measurement. Week 3, you take a measurement. And, week 4, you take a measurement. And so you want to be able to say, well, what's going to happen in week 5? Okay. So, obviously, once we have a time series like this, and, assuming that nothing changes, then we can, uh, just kind of extrapolate this out and see that this is what's going to happen here. Okay. So this is not a terribly comforting prediction, but the important thing to gather from this is that we're going to use a time series, and so the thing to notice about this is that this particular diagram differs from ones that we looked at before. Let's say when we're trying to look at the relationship between an x variable and a y variable. This time we're just taking one. We only have one variable, and we call that our y. So we're putting it over here. And in this case, it turns out our x variable is just time. And we want these to be equally spaced intervals. Now, there are time series that don't have equally spaced intervals, but for our purposes, we want to assume that these are equally spaced. Okay, so later on when we start to do regression, you'll see what we're going to do is time is going to be our independent variable, and our particular measurement that we're taking over time is going to be our dependent variable. Okay, all right, so time series then is just a sequence of measurements over of a single variable. Okay, so there are cases where you can measure multiple things and then you get what's called panel data, but a time series is just a single variable taken over time, usually at regular time intervals. Okay, so you see these all the time. In fact, we'll look at one later. Daily stock prices, or monthly interest rates, or quarterly sales, or yearly unemployment. So you see, here's one with the U.S. inflation rate. All we're doing, we have, it looks like 2-year intervals down here, and we're just taking a reading of the inflation rate at that time. Okay, we see that it was 1991, very high. Okay, it's been kept pretty well under control recently. Okay, changes in Fed policy. Okay, so when we have a time series, when we look at the way it moves through time, if we want to be able to make a prediction, like let's say, okay, we want to know what's going to be the next, or what's going to be 3 periods out. Okay, we have to use all of the information that we have in this time series. Okay, so there is a lot of evidence here. You don't want to simply take the slope as it is, because embedded within this, the shape of this is a whole bunch of patterns. Okay, so what we want to do in our forecasting is make best use of all the information that's in there. So if we see a long-term trend, we want to use that. If we see that every January there's a spike, we want to use that if we're trying to predict a January. And if there's any kind of long-term cyclical patterns, we want to incorporate those ups and downs of that cycle into our prediction. Okay, so what we have to do is identify the different components that we're going to use with our predictions. Okay, and so we're going to talk about 4 of them. We're interested in first, spotting, is there a long-term trend? So, if it goes, it might go up and down and up and down and up and down, but if we can see that it's that over the long haul that it's generally got an upward slope, then this is some information to say, well, the next time period will probably be higher. Okay. But there's also going to be a seasonal component. Most businesses do have some kind of seasonality to them. Fourth quarter tends to be a real great time for retail. So um, if you are trying to predict a fourth quarter, you're going to do something different from if the next time period is first quarter. Okay. And then there are also these cyclical components. Okay. Now these are larger things that we're not actually going to deal too much. We're not going to try to handle this in our own forecasting for this class. But basically, the idea behind these cyclical components is the business cycle. So you want to adjust your forecasting based on whether you appear to be coming out of a recession or going into a recession. Okay. And then finally, there's this, so these are all things that kind of affect the shape of the time series. And then there are these irregular components. It's just erratic or residual fluctuations. Okay. So these aren't really anything that we can use. And we're just going to call these, in the language of regression, these will be our errors. Okay. So there's always going to be a certain, stochasticity to these things. There's always going to be a little bit of a bump up and down that you can't possibly predict. So we're just going to call those our errors. And of course, as usual, we hope that they're small. We want to minimize these errors. But the idea is that these are things that we cannot roll into our predictions. But these other three things we can, although we will only be using these two. Okay. So to look at these things a little more closely. So, a trend is just a long-term thing. So we got like an upward trend here, okay? And a trend might be linear. So we might be able to just draw a line here, in which case we can use, simple linear regression, where time is our independent variable and our measurement, that is in this case sales, would be our dependent. But we might also have, something like this. If you have a curve like this, what you're looking at is, maybe like a market saturation. Everybody already has a cell phone, so it's kind of hard to get this kind of growth that you had at the beginning. So in this case, you might have to do like a different kind of forecast, a nonlinear forecast. Okay, so with a seasonal component, there are lots of businesses that do have seasonal components. Hotels, vacation properties, outdoor stores, swimming pools, lots of landscaping companies. There's going to be a seasonality where you might be doing better in the summer, or obviously if you're a ski resort, you're going to be doing better in winter. So you're going to have to consider, okay, well, what season are we in? And often these are just these correspond nicely to quarters, so we might just use a quarter to and then incorporate that into our forecast. Okay. All right. Now, just to show you in a little bit more detail some real data, this is air passengers between it looks like 1948 up to the early 60s, and this is an example of something that's going to have, clearly there's a trend here. I would say it's roughly linear. I don't think it's going to shoot up and do any kind of, go like that or anything. But it does look like we have a very, very consistent cycle here. Okay, where it looks like early in the year it's low, and then this, so this is 51 here. And then there's some growth, and then we peak somewhere. This is maybe the holiday season, holiday travel, and then it drops down. Okay, so every single year appears to have this exact same pattern. So you can see, okay, well, if I'm going to predict the next, well, what's going to be the next one? Well, this is probably the beginning of the year. Okay, so we have seen cases before where beginning of the year goes up, then it's probably going to go down a little bit and then go up a little bit, and then come to the holiday season like this. Okay, so you can see why we want to consider the upward trend as well as where we are in this smaller cycle pattern. Okay. All right. Now, the cyclical component, which we're not going to deal with too much, are they have to do with like the business cycle, recession, periods of recession and growth. There are ways to pull that into your regression using something similar to seasonality, but we're not going to do that in this class. Okay. All right. So, but the first thing we need to do, before we undertake any kind of forecast, is to take a look at our time series. Now, here's an example of a time series which has the rate of price inflation. Okay, so quarterly percentage change in the CPI. Okay, so this is a time series. Okay, it looks like we cover from 1960 all the way up to 2005, and they're just putting in the percent. Okay, so this is the percentage change, right? So if we were to look at this and then just say, okay, well, let's find that first component. We want to look at, is there any kind of long-term trend? And what is that trend? And, maybe we can use it as a slope. Just say, what is the slope? How is this thing sloping up or down in general? Now, so if you just eyeball this, it's awfully hard to come up with any kind of long-term trend. I mean, can you draw a line in here to actually say what the trend is? I mean, it looks like it went up and then it kind of went down. So this might be some kind of quadratic function of time. So something like this. But it's hard to tell because we have so much jumping up and down. So what we're going to talk about in this lecture then is how we go about spotting a trend in a time series by doing what's called smoothing. We have to smooth it out. And because it's too hard to sense any kind of pattern with all this jumping up and down, what we want to do is push down these peaks just a little bit and push up these troughs just a little bit. I mean, not so much that we're actually changing the character of the time series so that we're losing data, but enough that we can eyeball what's actually happening in the big picture. Okay, so we're going to do two smoothing methods. One is called a moving average, and the other one is called exponential smoothing. Okay. Smoothing. Okay, exponential smoothing. Okay, so let's take a look at the moving averages first. So what we're doing with a moving average is we smooth out a time series by averaging a certain number of values. So let's say you had you had measurements that were like 2 and 2 and 8 and 2 and 2. Okay, so we see this jump here, but if we were to, let's say average these two, we have a 2, and then we would average these two, and so that would be 5, and then we would average these two, so that would also be 5, and then we average these two, and that would be 4. 2. So we see we don't have quite this big jump anymore. Okay, so by averaging neighboring values, you kind of smooth out all of those big jumps. Now notice we still have this jump in the middle, this increase in the middle, but it's not as extreme. And so we can eyeball the visualization a little bit better. Okay, so that's all we're doing is we're deciding on how wide we want. In this case, I showed you this is a window of 2. So moving averages are often abbreviated MA, and then the number of elements of your time series you're averaging. So this would be an MA2. Okay, so all we're doing is going across this window and then averaging out all of the values in that window. So let's take a look at an example. So so in this case, okay, so if we were to do a 5-year moving average, all that means is that we're going to take 5 years, and then the first the first element of this would be years 1 through 5, and then their average. Of course, divide by 5 to get the average, okay? And then the second one, so we've got this window right here, okay? Now the second element of this new smooth time series is going to be years 2 through 6, okay? And that's what they show you down here, years 2 through 6, okay? So this is going to be, we're going to have our original time series, and then we're going to have our MA5. So we're going to have a bunch of values over here, so this is a series. We're going to wind up with a series over here too, but it's going to be averaging out a bunch of these and then sticking them over there. Okay, let me look at one more slide before we go ahead and calculate one. So in this example, okay, it starts off, so this blue box, so this is our, we've got our time series here. These are years and these are sales. Okay, I mean, this might be million or billion, but it doesn't matter. So we're going to take, to make a 5-year moving average, an MA5, we're going to start off with the first 5, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this blue box is our 5-year window. And then we're going to take that value and stick it in year 3. Now, why year 3? Well, because this is the center of this window, right? So if you have these 5 values and you've averaged them, where do you put them? Well, so you center it on 3, okay? So then when you slide the window down, so the next 5 is going to be this red box. Now you're going to center that on 4, because now this is the center of your window. Now, so notice what happened. We have a smaller series because we don't have 1 and 2. Okay, so the reason for that is obviously because our first window looked like this, and we lopped off. Okay, so we basically, because we were averaging these 5 and putting it on 3, we don't have a year 1 and a year 2. Now notice also we lost these 2 at the end because these were rolled into the calculation of the last 5. Okay. All right, so I think that'll be a little bit clearer once we work through an example. So let's go over and look at one. Okay. So I've got my sales figures here, and I'm going to I want to have a 5-year moving average. So I'm going to do a MA5 here. Okay. So that means my first window is going to consist of these 5, the first 5. Okay, but where do I put that average? Well, because the center of this window is on year 3, it's going to be at year 3. Okay, so we're going to go here, and I'm going to say, okay, this new series, this MA5, take the average of these 5. Okay, so that's my the first element. Let's see, so did I do that right? So B3 to B7. Okay, all right. So now this next one is going to be the average of 2 through 6. Okay, and then the next one is just going to be the average of 3 through 7. Okay, and I can copy this down, but I'm not going to. So 6 is centered on the window that goes 4 through 8, right? Okay, so you see how this is right in the middle of this window here? Okay, and this is centered on this 5 through 9 window. Okay, and this is centered on 6 through 10. Okay, and then this is going to be 7 through 11. Okay, and that's the last we have. Okay, now let's go ahead and it's a good idea to visualize your time series. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's take these and do insert, and then I'll come here and we'll do a rough chart. Okay, and then we'll just go ahead and make the title just so we know what we're looking at. Okay, so this is our original series here, and we can see that we have, it looks like we've got an upward overall trend, and we've got some kind of seasonality here where we've got these peaks. So there's a couple of components in this time series. So let's go ahead and add our new. So this blue one is our original time series. Let's go ahead and add another. We're going to add this on top of this. Okay. So let's if you go to format. No, sorry, design, you'll have this button that says you can select the data. Okay, so we see that we already have, we've already got our one series in here, and what we want to do is add another series. So now remember, we'll call this MA5. Okay, that's the name of the series. Now notice that we're actually going to be, these are actually Y values, right? Because we want them to be the dependent variable where time is the X variable. So we're going to leave X blank and then put these in the Y. And I'm going to select this whole range here so that it matches up with this series. Okay. All right. So notice what we did. So now we have this new series that, the first thing to observe is, we lost a couple of observations, right? So this was year 1 and 2. So we had to start at year 3 on this new MA5 series, okay? And now notice the other thing is that these peaks, we don't really have these big peaks anymore. We still have a little bit of a push here. This goes up because this second average included, this big peak here, okay, in year 6. Okay, so, but the important thing to know is that the moving average has smoothed out this time series quite a bit. And so now it's much more easy to eyeball this and say, well, there's clearly an upward trend. Okay. I want to show you where you can use this in the real world. I don't know if you have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. But if you do, this is something that you can play with. If you come to the directly off the home page, there are these links to these various market indexes up here, and we're just going to come to the Dow Jones, and they give you this nice time series over here of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and I'm going to come here to Advanced Charting. And all of these different indexes have advanced charting available. So go there to that. Okay, I'm just going to take this off. Okay, so notice that we've got a time series here, and it lets us pick up here the time frame that we want to have. So if you want to just look at today, or 5 days, or 1 month, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, or all. So this is, so-called all of time. By their measure, all time starts in 1987. Now, the Dow Jones has been around since the 1800s, so this is just where they decided would be, a reasonable time to start. And so, we can see that we have, various of those components that are built in here. We've got some cyclicality, and we can see that there's a general long-term upward trend here. But let's go ahead and use some of these tools to provide a better visualization. It has this drop down here that lets you pick chart overlays, and it does have a simple moving average down here. So it lets you add a moving average to that, and you can configure the moving average. So if I were to have a moving average, which is a period of 1, that is exactly the same as having no moving average at all. Okay, so if I have a moving average of let's say 20 periods, okay, so you see I lopped off a bunch of periods at the beginning and not at the end, and I'll explain why in a little while. So this is the SMA 20, so simple moving average 20, and you can see how it has smoothed out the peaks and the troughs. Okay. Now, if I change this to 1, you see that it's indistinguishable from the original time series. If I make it 2, it starts to appear. So basically, the more periods you're averaging, the more smoothing you're getting. So if I do 100, that's, I got pretty much no data at all. If you average them all together, you don't have a time series anymore. You have a point. So, okay. All right. So there's an example of how you can use the moving average, and by the way, if we put that on there, it does let us see. Let's go a little more than this. Let's do 30. So this moving average, as you see, does help you see that there's a generally upward trend, and it's been going faster lately. So you see how we have this little scoop up here. Okay. All right. So there's a simple moving average. This is just one way to smooth out a time series. Okay. So the other way that you can smooth out a time series is what's called exponential smoothing. And the motivation behind this is, if you think about it, in when we were doing the Dow Jones time series, we were averaging 30 periods together. And if you think about it, does it make sense to weigh them all the same? So whether it's last quarter or 20 quarters ago, those all count the same for my average. And if you think about it, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. What you would want to do is, smooth out by making the average, but show preferential treatment to the more recent data. Okay, so you want to weight the more recent data more heavily, and then kind of taper it off as it goes down. So the further periods are still rolled into the calculation, but they have a much smaller weight than the more recent ones. Okay, so this is what we do with exponential smoothing. So exponential smoothing is just a weighted moving average. Okay, so what we do is we choose what our weight, our smoothing coefficient is a weight, and this is going to be how heavily we want to weigh the current period. Okay, so if we want the current period to be very heavily weighted, notice it ranges from 0 to 1. If we want it to be heavy weighted, then we do 0.9. Okay, if we want to say, well, it's only a little bit more important than the previous values, then we might just set it to 0.6. Okay, and if we set it to 0.5, this is going to be the same as the simple moving average. Okay, because remember, the simple moving average, if it had 2 periods, then it weighed each one 0.5. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at how you calculate it, and then I'll demonstrate in action how you calculate it. Okay, so you have to start with the first. So remember that because our time series, we're putting t on the x-axis, and we're putting our measurement on the y-axis. We're using y for the actual original time series value. Okay, actual time series value is denoted with a y. Okay, so in this case, then, the E stands for the exponential smoothed value. Okay, so the way we smooth the first one is we just set it equal. Okay, so we're going to have our series over here, and we're going to have our smooth version of the series over here. If this is 5, 7, 8, then this first box here we're just going to pull over y and say, okay, the first one is just the first y. Okay, so that's where you start. You fill that first box there. Okay, and then for every other value, okay, then you take that w, that weighting smoothing coefficient, multiply it by whatever the current y is. So this is for every I greater than 1, right? For I, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so every other row, multiply whatever the y is in that row by w, and then add it to 1 minus w times, now notice this is the exponentially smoothed value for the previous time period. So the previous smoothed value. Okay, and that's why it's E. Okay. All right, so you see what we have here is we're taking an average of the current value and the previously smooth value, and we're distributing weights according to whatever we set W to. Okay. Now, again, this will probably become clearer as if we do an example. Okay. So I'm now going to take the same series that we had before and add an exponentially smoothed series to it. And I'm going to keep this open so you can refer to it as I edit. Okay. All right, so we're going to call this exponentially smoothed. Okay. Now, so we start here at the top. Well, actually, we need to come up with a W. Okay. So let's just say our W is we want to put a heavy emphasis on the recent values. So we'll set W equal to 0.9. And to emphasize the fact that this is a parameter, I'm going to color it this way. Okay, and so we're going to need 1 minus W in our calculations. So I'll just set this equal to 1 minus what's up here. Okay, all right, and once again, I'll mark that out. Okay, so we're going to use W and 1 minus W in calculating the series. Okay, so we start with, we start in year 1, and the exponentially smooth value for year 1 is just exactly the same as what's in year 1. Okay, so it's just going to be equal to whatever's here. Okay, all right, so far so good. Now, for every subsequent one, we need to set it equal to W, which is here, times the current value of the series, which is here, plus 1 minus W, which we calculated here, times the previously smoothed value, which is here up above us. So this is E1. Okay, so you see that? So we took W times Y1 plus 1 minus W times E1. Okay, all right, and we calculated that there. Now I'm going to go up here and these cells here, I'm going to make these absolute references so that I can copy this down. And I won't copy the first one just to so that you're clear on how it's calculated. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another one, and then we'll copy down. Okay, so we're going to say, okay, so for this one, we're going to set it equal to W. Okay, W times whatever's in the series. This is our Y3, Y sub 3, plus 1 minus W. Okay, again, make it absolute, times the previously smooth value, which is up above us here. Okay. All right. So now I think that's clear, and we can just go ahead and compute that. Now notice a couple things about this series here. Unlike the moving average, we don't lose values from the beginning and the end because we're setting the first one equal to what's there, and then every subsequent one is some function of W and what was previously calculated. So as long as we have a previously calculated value, we can just come, step down and come up with a value for every level, every element of the series. Okay, so now we've got our exponentially smooth. Let's go ahead and add this series now to this sales chart. And I'll do this by clicking here, coming to Design, and select Data. So I'm going to add this other series here, and this will be our exponentially smoothed. And once again, it's Y values that we're selecting, so we'll just select the whole series here. Okay, so it's in gray there. Now this is awfully close to the original time series, and the reason for that is because we set W equal to 0.9. So what that means is that it's very, very heavily weighting whatever was originally in that year on that time series. So if I change this, I'm going to lower it a little bit here. So notice now it's increasing the smoothness of it by pushing down those peaks and pulling up those troughs. Okay, I'm going to lower it a little bit more. Okay, and lower it a little more. Okay, and I can just keep going. I mean, if I wanted to, I could stress the the further away values more by setting this to less than 0.5. Okay, and I could even set this now to 0.1. So now we just have something that is just insanely smooth, and we can clearly identify that upward pattern a little bit more. I don't think you would want to do it quite this much, but maybe this kind of gives a pretty good picture of how to do that. Okay, so there's the that's how you calculate an exponentially smooth series. Let's take a look at the let's add an exponentially smooth series to the Wall Street Journal Dow Jones. So let's put our simple moving average back on there, and now notice that it's got an exponential moving average. Okay, so they call it a moving average, but it's still exponentially smoothed. Okay, so all right, now notice there's a couple of things to observe here. Let's come here to edit. Now notice that it only asks us for the number of periods, and remember that in our particular case, when we were doing smoothing, we always did 2 periods. We always did a weighted average of the current period and the previous period. Now, what you could do is do a weighted average of 3 periods, 4 periods, 5 periods. You could go back as far as you want. But notice that if you have a whole lot of time periods, if you're going to say, I want 30, I want to have an exponentially smoothed series that goes back 30 periods, then you want to make sure that you start with a reasonably small W, right? Because if we set this to 0.9, that means that those other 29 periods have to split up 0.1 between them. So what the Wall Street Journal does is rather than letting you set W, you set the number of periods. So we set the number of periods equal to 20, and it has a formula for picking what it considers to be a nice value for W. So W in their world is a function of P. So if you set P, they'll calculate W. And in their case, this function is they set W equal to 2 over P plus 1. Okay. So for example, if you pick 3 periods, then it's going to set W equal to 2 over 4. If you want to do 2 periods, then like we did here, this is 2 periods, then it will set W automatically to 2/3. Okay. So let's take a look at the difference between this exponentially smoothed series versus the moving average. So this moving average this had 30 periods. So let's make this 30 periods too. So we're comparing apples to apples. Okay. Now notice that the difference between the two. So they're both smoothed quite a bit. In fact, maybe if we bump this down a little bit, we'll have a more something more descriptive. Well, let's see. Still, maybe 15. Let's see what that looks like. 15. Okay. So notice that they both follow roughly the same kind of pattern, but notice that the exponentially smoothed one tends to respond more quickly to the ups and downs. Okay. Now, not so quickly that it's the same series. It doesn't jump up and down right away, but notice that it's a little bit quicker to respond to changes than the simple moving averages. So for example, right here, where the in 2002 it started to drop, and the exponentially smooth series started dropping, but the simple moving average didn't drop quite so quickly. It took it a while to catch up. And then likewise, when it started rising over here, you see that the exponentially smooth average started responding more quickly. Okay. All right. So so that's the exponentially smooth. Now, one thing I want to point out that's a question on your homework assignment. It asks you in your MSL 15. It says if you're using exponential smoothing for forecast, and what is your forecast for next year if the smooth value for this year is 32.4 million? Okay, so all you do once you have smoothed your time series, your prediction, your forecast for the next period is going to be exactly the same as your last value. Okay, so if the smooth value for this year is 32.4 million, this means that the next period is going to be 32.4 million. Okay, so that's how you use the exponentially smoothed series to predict. You just set the next period equal to your currently smoothed. Remember your smooth, E sub I. Okay, not the actual value in the original time series, the smooth value. Okay, so that's how you use that. Now, as always, Excel provides you with ways of doing these things, and I want to caution you against using them for the moving average and the exponential smoothing, because they do something a little bit different in terms of where they center the series, and I'll show you why. So let's do in this column, and I don't have I'm going to this is going to be Excel's MA5, and this will be Excel's exponential smoothing. Okay, so in this column right here. Okay, so let's go to data analysis, and you may have noticed that it does have a moving average option here, and it does let you pick your input range. So our input is going to be our sales here. Okay, and the labels are in the first row. We'll just take the default interval. We don't have very many values here. And our output range, we're just going to say, okay, start there. Okay. All right, and then we'll click OK. Okay, now notice that it differs from, oh, sorry. Let's go back here. Let's do that again. I meant to do an MA5, so we're going to do moving average with they call the interval, the period. Okay, period is called interval here. So we're going to do that, Okay, now notice what it did. So we took this first value and then centered it on 3 because that was the middle of the 5-year window. What Excel did was it took the first 5 years, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it stuck the the moving average over into the 5th year. Okay, so notice that we have a little bit of a phase shift of 2 years here, and so we can make these match up if we delete these and then take these and move them up to here. Okay, all right, so now these values match up and it makes sense. But if you are going to use Excel for moving average, just note that it does put the first entry of the MA5 into year number 5. Okay, so let's see what it does for exponential smoothing then. Okay, so exponential smoothing is also an option under here. Okay, same input as before, sales. Now, it asks us to input a damping factor, and the damping factor is just 1 minus W. So you can look at this, we use W as weight for our current year. The damping factor is how much you want to damp previous years. Okay, so that's 1 minus W. So let's set that equal to what we have there, so 0.4, and we'll put the series there. Okay, and all right. Okay, we didn't select forgot to put this. Okay. All right, so let's get rid of that, see what we're looking at here. Okay, now notice again, it left something weird here, and then everything was, it looks like the right values, but it was shifted down. So let's cut this and paste it there. So now we see that it's a match. Okay. All right. So you can use the Excel. Just be aware that it does do a little bit of a period shifting thing there, and you just have to be aware of that. And if you would like to know why it is that this is called exponential smoothing, even though apparently we have not seen a single exponent, I'm going to put another video on there up for, that'll be kind of like a bonus video. And for my students who are watching, if you made it this far, congratulations. And I'd like to give you extra credit for watching the whole thing. So please just email me. Send me an email with a single code word in it, and the code word is Bluebird. Okay, don't share it with your classmates, because the better your grade is, the better their grade is, the worse yours is by comparison, right? So there's a curve. So so don't let it get around.